The night I realized I had become invisible in my own home, no one raised their voice, and that was the problem. We were sitting around the dining table Ethan had insisted on refinishing after his father passed, the same oak table that had held 30 years of Thanksgiving turkeys and birthday cakes with too many candles to count. Lauren was talking about repainting the living room, something light and modern, maybe a cool gray. Ethan nodded, scrolling through his phone between bites of roasted chicken. I waited for one of them to look at me, to ask what I thought. After all, I had chosen the warm cream color on those walls 20 years ago, back when this house still felt like mine. We'll probably turn the downstairs guest room into a home office, Lauren said, her tone casual, decisive. There's no reason to keep it the way it is. The downstairs guest room. She meant my bedroom. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. No one corrected her. No one clarified. It was a small sentence, spoken in a normal voice, but it carried the weight of a verdict. I had been reduced to a temporary arrangement. After Thomas died 3 years ago, I told myself that change was natural. Ethan had moved back in to help me manage things. That was how he phrased it. Lauren followed 6 months later, smiling brightly, calling me Margaret instead of Mom, explaining how much easier it would be if we combined households. At first, I was grateful. The house had felt too quiet after the funeral, too still. The refrigerator hummed louder than usual. The hallway clock seemed to tick with a kind of accusation. Having them there filled the silence. But silence has layers. The first layer is loneliness. The second is observation. I began noticing how often decisions were made in the kitchen while I was upstairs folding laundry. How often I heard the word "we" used in ways that did not include me. We think it's time to update the furniture. We're considering refinancing. We might host Christmas this year. It was subtle, polite even. Lauren never raised her voice. She never insulted me. She simply rearranged the structure of the house the way someone rearranges furniture, inch by inch until the original shape is unrecognizable. The Wi-Fi password changed one afternoon without explanation. My favorite armchair disappeared from the corner of the living room because it didn't match the aesthetic. The silver-framed photograph of Thomas in his Navy uniform was moved from the mantel to a shelf in the hallway. It's still visible, Lauren said when I picked it up and dusted the glass with my sleeve. We just needed balance. Balance. I repeated that word to myself often. I balanced my checkbook. I balanced grocery lists. I balanced my grief with practicality. What I did not balance was my position in the home I had paid off 15 years earlier, the deed still bearing Thomas's and my names. That night at dinner, as they discussed paint samples and future renovations, I realized something quietly profound. They were not asking because they no longer believed they needed to. I was background, a kind presence, a temporary detail. I finished my meal and carried my plate to the sink. The water ran warm over my hands as I rinsed away gravy and crumbs. In the reflection of the kitchen window, I saw myself, 72 years old, silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of my neck, shoulders still straight. I did not look fragile. I did not look confused. I looked like a woman who had been listening for a very long time. Ethan laughed at something Lauren showed him on her phone. Their voices blended together, comfortable, unified. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands carefully. That was the moment I stopped waiting to be included. They mistook my silence for surrender. They believed my quiet meant agreement. They had no idea it meant I was finally paying attention. The morning after that dinner, nothing looked different, and that was what unsettled me most. The coffee maker clicked on at 6:30, as it always had. The sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds in thin, even stripes across the tile floor. Lauren stood at the counter in workout clothes, blending something green and expensive-looking in a tall glass container. Ethan skimmed the business section on his tablet. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the far end of the table, the seat that had slowly become mine by default. They were discussing a weekend trip to Asheville, something about a cabin in the mountains, and a winery tour. We deserve a break, Lauren said lightly. Ethan agreed. I listened for the invitation that did not come. It was not the absence of the trip that hurt. I have never needed to travel to feel content. It was the assumption that I would remain here, tending to the house, feeding the dog, watering the plants, as if I were part of the maintenance plan rather than the family. After they left for the day, I walked through the living room slowly. The new gray paint samples leaned against the wall like quiet declarations. The old cream color, The one Thomas and I chose together one Saturday afternoon at a hardware store on Route 9 looked suddenly outdated under their scrutiny. I ran my fingers along the mantel where his photograph used to stand. The surface felt wider without it, emptier. I remembered the day we moved into this house 32 years ago. Ethan was 13. He complained about the long driveway and the lack of cable television for the first week. Thomas promised him it would feel like home by Christmas. It did. We hosted every holiday here. We measured Ethan against the pantry doorframe every year until he was taller than both of us. The house was never just square footage and resale value. It was proof of endurance. That afternoon, I opened the hallway closet and found a cardboard box I had not seen before. Inside were folded quilts, extra linens, and the small brass lamp that used to sit on my bedside table. A sticky note rested on top in Lauren's tidy handwriting. For donation. I held the lamp in my hands and turned the switch. The bulb still worked. I placed it back in the box and closed the lid carefully. No confrontation formed in my throat. No sharp words pressed against my teeth. Instead, there was a quiet accounting happening inside me. A list of changes. A tally of moments. That evening, Ethan mentioned refinancing the house to take advantage of lower interest rates. It makes sense financially, he said. Lauren nodded and added that updating the kitchen would increase property value significantly. Property value. Investment. Equity. I noticed how often those words appeared in their conversations now. Not once did either of them say memory. Not once did they say history. I cleared the dinner plates and wiped the counter in slow, even strokes. I was not being pushed out with cruelty. I was being edited out with efficiency. There is a difference, and it is harder to protest something that arrives dressed as practicality. I went upstairs and opened the drawer of Thomas's old desk. Inside lay the original deed, folded neatly in a manila envelope, along with insurance papers and tax records. My name was printed there beside his in solid black ink. I traced the letters with the tip of my finger. I was not confused. I was not dependent. I was not temporary. For 3 years I had allowed grief to soften my edges, to make me grateful for any company at all. But grief fades. Clarity does not. I placed the documents back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer. Downstairs, I could hear Lauren laughing at something on television. Ethan's voice followed, relaxed and easy. They believed the structure of this home had already shifted entirely in their favor. They believed silence meant consent. They did not understand that silence can also be preparation. 2 days later, I heard my future discussed as if it were a calendar adjustment. I was coming down the stairs slowly, one hand resting on the banister, when their voices drifted from the kitchen. They did not sound angry. They sounded efficient. Lauren was explaining something she had researched online. There are beautiful senior communities about 40 minutes from here, she said. Some of them even have on-site fitness centers and group activities. It would be good for her to be around people her own age. Ethan responded with a low murmur of agreement. It might actually make things easier for everyone, he added. Easier for everyone. I paused halfway down the stairs and remained still. The word her hung in the air like a label. Not Mom. Not Margaret. Just her. I stepped down the final few stairs deliberately so they would hear me coming. Their conversation stopped instantly. Lauren turned with a bright, practiced smile. Good morning, she said, as if we had not just been measuring my life in terms of convenience. I returned the smile. Good morning, I answered, my voice steady and even. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and lemon cleaner. Everything looked polished. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter, feeling the cool granite under my fingertips. Ethan glanced at Lauren, then back at me. We were just talking about some options for the future, he said carefully. You know, long-term planning. I nodded once. Planning is important, I replied. No one elaborated. No one invited me into the specifics. That afternoon, Lauren left brochures on the dining table. She did not hand them to me directly. She placed them neatly beside the fruit bowl as if they had arrived by accident. I sat down and flipped through the glossy pages. Photographs of smiling seniors playing cards, walking through landscaped gardens, sipping tea in common rooms with tasteful furniture. Words like carefree, maintenance-free, vibrant community printed in cheerful fonts. I traced the edges of one brochure and imagined myself there. Another quiet woman in a coordinated sweater set, grateful for bingo nights and scheduled transportation to the grocery store. There was nothing wrong with those communities. But there was something wrong with the assumption that I was ready to be relocated like excess furniture. That evening, Lauren mentioned the subject again while rinsing dishes. "It is just something to think about," she said lightly. "The house is a lot of work. Stairs can be risky." I dried a plate with slow precision. "I have managed stairs for 72 years, I said calmly. "I believe I still understand how they function." She laughed softly, as if I had made a charming joke. Ethan did not meet my eyes. I began noticing how often my future was framed as a problem to solve. The yard required maintenance. The roof would need replacement in a few years. Property taxes had increased. Each practical concern was valid. Each one was presented as evidence that the logical solution was my departure. That night I sat at Thomas's desk again and opened the file cabinet drawer beneath it. Inside were organized folders, each labeled in my handwriting. Mortgage payoff confirmation, insurance policy, investment statements. I reviewed them carefully, page by page. The house was not a burden. It was an asset. It was fully paid for. It did not require refinancing. It did not require permission. I realized then that the conversation about senior living was not about my safety. It was about space. It was about ownership. It was about accelerating a transition that had already begun the night Lauren first referred to my bedroom as a guest room. I closed the file drawer and sat back. In the leather chair Thomas once used. The room felt smaller than it had years ago, but my thoughts felt sharper. I was not being guided toward comfort. I was being eased toward exit. They believed I would eventually agree out of politeness, out of fear of being alone, out of gratitude for their company. They did not understand that I had already survived the deepest loneliness a person can experience. I had buried my husband. I had stood at his graveside and returned to an empty bed. I was not afraid of solitude. I was beginning to understand that what I feared was erasure. And that fear, unlike grief, did not make me softer. It made me precise. The following Sunday, Lauren hosted brunch for 2 couples from Ethan's office. I was informed of it the night before, not invited, just informed. "We are having a few people over tomorrow around 11, she said while scrolling through her phone. "It will be casual." Casual meant I would stay upstairs until the laughter settled into the walls and the scent of coffee faded from the air. I woke early anyway and dressed in a light blue cardigan Thomas once said made my eyes look brighter. I moved quietly through the kitchen at 8:30, placing fresh flowers in a glass vase and setting out the white serving platter we used for holidays. Lauren came downstairs shortly after, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second when she saw the table already arranged. "Oh," she said, forcing a smile. "You did not have to do that." I nodded. "I have been setting tables in this house for 3 decades. I replied gently. "It is not an inconvenience." She hesitated, then began rearranging what I had placed, shifting the platter a few inches, replacing my cloth napkins with disposable ones she had purchased in bulk. It was not about napkins. It was about authorship. At 11:15, the doorbell rang. I remained in the kitchen while introductions floated in from the hallway. Laughter followed, easy and bright. I could hear Lauren describing the house, explaining how they had taken on a renovation project after moving in. Moving in. The phrase echoed, as if this home had been discovered, claimed, reimagined by them alone. I stepped into the living room with a polite smile and greeted the guests. Ethan introduced me as his mother, his voice careful but distant. One of the women complimented the architecture and asked how long they had lived here. Lauren answered before I could. "Almost 3 years now," she said. "It has really become ours." I felt the weight of that sentence settle across my shoulders. Almost 3 years now. Thomas had spent 32 years building stability within these walls. We painted the nursery together when Ethan was born. We planted the maple tree in the front yard when he turned 10. We replaced the roof after a heavy storm when he left for college. But in that living room, under soft lighting and polite conversation, history was reduced to a recent acquisition. I excused myself and walked upstairs, not out of hurt, but out of recognition. I stood in the hallway outside what used to be our bedroom. The door was open. Lauren had replaced the comforter with a gray one that matched her paint samples. My brass lamp was gone. The quilt my mother stitched before she passed had been folded and placed in a storage bin beneath the bed. I knelt down and slid the bin out carefully. The fabric still carried the faint scent of lavender sachets I had tucked between its folds years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed and rested my hands in my lap. There are moments when the truth does not arrive loudly. It arrives like a draft under a closed door, subtle but undeniable. I was not being openly rejected. I was being gradually rewritten out of the narrative of this house. Downstairs, applause broke out at something someone said. I could imagine Lauren standing near the fireplace, gesturing toward the updated fixtures, explaining future plans for expansion. Future plans. I rose from the bed and returned the quilt to its place. Then I walked to Thomas's desk and opened the small locked drawer beneath the top right corner. Inside was a second envelope I had not examined in months. It contained the updated estate documents we signed 10 years before he passed. I read the lines carefully, my eyes steady. The structure of ownership was clear. The authority was clear. I closed the envelope and placed it back inside the drawer, locking it gently. Downstairs, the brunch continued as if the house itself had agreed to its own transition. I stood by the window in the hallway and watched sunlight spill across the driveway, where Thomas once taught Ethan how to change a tire. I felt no anger, only alignment. They were preparing for a future they assumed would unfold without resistance. I was preparing for something else entirely. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the bank alone. I did not mention the appointment to Ethan. I did not leave a note for Lauren. I simply picked up my handbag, the brown leather one Thomas bought me for our 40th anniversary, and walked out the front door at 10:15. The air was cool, just under 60 degrees, the kind of early fall morning that makes the sky look sharper than usual. I drove past the maple tree in the yard, the one we planted when Ethan turned 10. Its leaves were beginning to turn at the edges. Change always starts quietly. The bank had not changed much in the past decade. The same beige walls. The same framed photographs of local landmarks. I asked to speak with Mr. Henderson, the branch manager who had handled our mortgage payoff 15 years ago. When he saw me, he stood and shook my hand with the same steady politeness he had shown Thomas. "Mrs. Collins," he said warmly. "It has been a while." I nodded. "I believe it has." We sat across from each other at a polished desk. I placed the envelope from Thomas's desk in front of him and asked him to review the current status of all accounts tied to my name. He clicked through documents on his screen, his expression neutral and professional. "Everything is solely in your name now," he confirmed. "The house, the primary savings, the investment account. There are no co-owners listed." I allowed that information to settle into the room without reaction. "I would like to open a separate checking account," I said. "One that only I can access." He nodded without hesitation and began preparing the paperwork. The process was straightforward. "Sign here. Initial there. Provide identification." I signed each line slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the action to register fully in my own mind. I was not responding emotionally. I was responding structurally. When the final document was complete, Mr. Henderson asked if there was anything else he could assist with. I considered the question for a moment. "I would also like information about listing a property," I said calmly. His eyes lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. "We can connect you with a trusted real estate agent," he replied. "Whenever you are ready." "Whenever you are ready." I thanked him and stood. The decision had not been spoken aloud at home, but it had been forming for weeks, perhaps months. Outside, I sat in my car for a few minutes before turning the key in the ignition. I watched people enter and exit the bank, each carrying their own invisible calculations. Money is not just currency. It is leverage. It is timing. It is permission. When I returned home, Lauren was in the living room with a laptop open, browsing what appeared to be renovation websites. Ethan's work bag rested near the door, which meant he had come home early. They both looked up when I stepped inside. "How was your morning?" Ethan asked casually. "Productive," I answered. Lauren smiled politely and returned her attention to the screen. I walked upstairs and placed the new bank documents in the locked drawer beneath Thomas's desk. The drawer closed with a soft click that sounded almost ceremonial. That evening at dinner, the conversation revolved around paint samples again. Lauren held up 2 gray swatches side by side and asked Ethan which one felt more modern. "The darker one," he said. "It makes the room look bigger." I listened without comment. Bigger for whom? I wondered silently. After clearing the dishes, I stepped outside onto the back porch. The yard stretched wide and familiar before me. 32 years of seasons had passed across this grass. Birthday parties, graduation photographs, quiet evenings with iced tea and conversation that did not require negotiation. I stood there until the air grew colder and the porch light flickered on automatically. Inside, I could hear Lauren explaining to Ethan how much value a remodeled kitchen would add to the house. Add value. The phrase echoed in my mind. They believed they were increasing their future. They did not yet understand that I was already shaping mine. By the end of the week, the house felt different, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because I had stopped seeing it through their lens and started measuring it through my own. On Thursday morning, I contacted the real estate agent Mr. Henderson had recommended. Her name was Caroline Whitaker, and she had been selling properties in this county for over 20 years. Her voice on the phone was calm and direct, the kind that does not waste time on unnecessary sympathy. We scheduled a preliminary visit for the following Monday at 10 in the morning, a time when Ethan would be at work and Lauren would be at her yoga class. I did not hide the appointment, but I did not announce it either. Silence works best when it is consistent. Over the weekend, I walked through each room with a small notepad, jotting down details. Square footage of the living room, the age of the roof, the year we updated the plumbing. I opened cabinets and checked hinges, ran my fingers along baseboards, tested light switches. The house was solid. It did not require rescuing. It required clarity. Lauren spent Saturday afternoon measuring the kitchen for potential renovations. I watched her kneel by the cabinets, stretching a tape measure across the countertops. If we remove this wall, it would open up the entire space, she said to Ethan. It would completely transform the layout. Transform. Another word that suggested the present was insufficient. I folded laundry at the dining table and listened. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. It would make it feel more like ours, he replied. The sentence settled quietly between them. More like ours. I finished folding a white cotton shirt and placed it neatly in a stack. That evening, I opened my laptop in Thomas's study and searched for coastal condominiums in Florida. I did not search for senior housing. I searched for ocean views. 2 bedrooms. Balcony access. Within walking distance of a grocery store. I studied photographs of sunlight reflecting off water, of modest but well-maintained buildings with palm trees lining the sidewalks. I imagined waking to the sound of waves instead of muted discussions about property value. I calculated costs carefully, comparing them against my savings and investment accounts. The numbers aligned more easily than I expected. On Monday morning, Caroline arrived promptly at 10. She walked through the front door with a leather folder tucked under her arm and a measured expression that told me she had seen many transitions like this before. We toured the house slowly. She noted the hardwood floors, the updated windows, the size of the backyard. It is a strong property, she said. Finally, with the current market, it would attract serious buyers quickly. I nodded. How quickly? I asked. She gave me an estimated timeline. Weeks, not months. The efficiency of it all felt almost mathematical. Before she left, she asked if anyone else needed to be consulted before listing. I met her eyes directly. No, I answered. That afternoon, I signed the preliminary paperwork. The pen felt steady in my hand. I was not reacting to pressure. I was responding to pattern. When Ethan returned home that evening, he mentioned that Lauren had found a contractor willing to provide a quote for the kitchen remodel. We are thinking of moving forward soon, he said, enthusiasm edging into his voice. I looked at him across the table, at the lines around his eyes that had deepened over the years, at the familiar tilt of his head that still reminded me of the boy who once asked me to check for monsters under his bed. That sounds ambitious, I replied evenly. He smiled, unaware of the timing he had miscalculated. Upstairs, in the locked drawer of Thomas's desk, the listing agreement rested beside the bank documents. Outside, the maple leaves were turning fully red now, falling one by one onto the driveway. Change rarely asks permission. It simply arrives when preparation meets decision. The listing went live on Wednesday at exactly 9 in the morning. Caroline called to confirm that the photographs had been uploaded and the price had been set according to our discussion. I stood in the kitchen while she spoke, my hand resting lightly on the counter that Lauren had planned to replace. Outside, a small sign was placed at the edge of the front yard, white with black lettering, discreet but unmistakable. I watched from the window as the agent secured it into the ground with 2 firm presses of her foot. It was a quiet declaration. Nothing in the house shifted physically, yet the atmosphere tightened as if the walls themselves were aware of the decision. Ethan returned home shortly after 6 that evening. He parked in the driveway and paused longer than usual before stepping out of the car. I saw him notice the sign immediately. His posture stiffened, confusion crossing his face before he reached the front door. Lauren was upstairs when he entered. I remained seated at the dining table, a cup of tea untouched. In front of me, he stepped inside, closed the door slowly, and looked at me as though I had moved something fundamental without warning. "Mom," he said carefully, "why is there a for sale sign in the yard?" I folded my hands in my lap and met his eyes. "Because the house is for sale," I replied. The sentence did not tremble. It did not rise in pitch. It simply existed. Lauren descended the stairs quickly, her expression tight. "What do you mean the house is for sale?" she asked, her voice sharper than usual. I turned toward her with the same calm I had carried for weeks. "I met with an agent on Monday. The listing went live this morning." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the living room. "You should have talked to us," he said. "We were planning renovations. We were going to invest in this place." Invest. The word sounded different now. I considered it for a moment before answering. "You were planning renovations," I said gently. "I was planning my future." Lauren's composure faltered. "You cannot just decide this without including us," she insisted. I tilted my head slightly. "The deed is in my name," I said. "It has been for years." Silence followed, heavy but not chaotic. Ethan stopped pacing and stared at the floor, as if recalculating something he had assumed was fixed. "Where are we supposed to go?" he asked finally. The question carried disbelief more than fear. I inhaled slowly. "You are both capable adults," I answered. "You have jobs. You have savings. You have plans." I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply removed myself from the equation they had quietly adjusted months ago. Lauren crossed her arms tightly. "This is unfair," she said under her breath. I allowed the word to pass between us without resistance. Unfair had been the language of children when Ethan was small. He used to shout it when bedtime came too early or when his allowance did not stretch far enough. I stood from the table and carried my teacup to the sink. "There will be showings starting this weekend," I said calmly. "You will need to keep common areas tidy." The practicality of the statement seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Ethan looked up at me, his expression shifting from frustration to something closer to realization. "Are you leaving?" he asked quietly. I paused for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," I said. "I am." No dramatic announcement. No slammed doors. Just clarity. Upstairs, the locked drawer in Thomas's desk held the documents that had made this moment possible. Outside, the white sign stood steady against the fading light. For the first time in months, the house felt aligned with my decisions rather than theirs. Silence had never been surrender. It had been structure. And now that structure was visible. The first showing was scheduled for Saturday at 1 in the afternoon. Caroline called Friday evening to confirm that 2 couples had already expressed serious interest. I relayed the information at breakfast with the same tone one might use to announce a change in weather. Ethan nodded stiffly. Lauren said nothing, but she spent the rest of the morning wiping down surfaces that had not been dusty in years. By noon on Saturday, the house looked staged in a way it never had before. Pillows were arranged at precise angles. Fresh lemons sat in a bowl on the counter. Even the air smelled faintly of vanilla from a candle Lauren insisted on lighting. I walked through each room slowly, not to inspect, but to say goodbye in increments. In the living room, I paused by the fireplace where Thomas once hung our stockings every December. I could still picture Ethan at 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on the rug, waiting for permission to open the first gift. Upstairs, I stood in the hallway outside the bedroom that had quietly shifted from ours to temporary. The gray comforter was smoothed tight across the mattress. The quilt my mother stitched remained stored beneath the bed. I knelt down, pulled it out one final time, and folded it carefully into a suitcase I had already placed in the closet. Packing had begun without ceremony. 2 suitcases. 1 small trunk for photographs. No frantic sorting. No dramatic gestures. Just deliberate selection. When the doorbell rang at 12:55, I was seated at the dining table with a glass of water. Caroline entered first, followed by a couple in their late 30s who examined the hardwood floors with interest. I greeted them politely and stepped aside as they moved from room to room. I heard them comment on the natural light in the kitchen and the size of the backyard. They asked about the roof, the plumbing, the property taxes. Caroline answered with practiced clarity. Ethan stood near the staircase, arms crossed, his jaw set. Lauren hovered close to him, her smile controlled and professional. I watched the couple walk upstairs and pause in the hallway. It feels solid, the woman said. Like it has been well cared for. I allowed myself a small nod. Well cared for. That was the phrase that mattered. After they left, another couple arrived within the hour. The rhythm of footsteps and polite questions repeated itself. By 4 o'clock, the house had been evaluated more thoroughly in one afternoon than it had been in the previous 3 years of renovation plans. When the final visitors stepped out into the driveway, Caroline lingered by the front door. "You may receive an offer sooner than you expect," she said quietly to me. I thanked her and closed the door gently. The house fell into an unfamiliar silence, not heavy, but anticipatory. Ethan exhaled sharply and ran a hand over his face. "This is happening fast," he said. I met his gaze steadily. "It has been happening for a long time," I replied. That evening, I carried one suitcase down the stairs and placed it by the front hall closet. Lauren noticed, but did not comment. Her eyes followed the movement, calculating, adjusting. I did not rush. I did not explain. I moved through the rooms one last time before bed, touching door frames lightly with my fingertips, as if confirming their shape. The maple tree outside cast long shadows across the driveway under the porch light. Tomorrow, there might be an offer. Soon after, there would be paperwork. And then, there would be a new address. The house was no longer a battleground of quiet assumptions. It was a completed chapter, closing exactly when it needed to. The offer arrived Monday morning at 8:43. Caroline called just as I finished packing the last of my books into a medium-sized cardboard box. Her voice carried the quiet satisfaction of a job moving efficiently. "It is strong," she said. "Full asking price. Flexible closing date." I looked around the study where Thomas's desk now stood nearly empty, sunlight resting gently across the hardwood floor. "Accept it," I replied without hesitation. The paperwork was signed electronically before noon. By early afternoon, the house that had sheltered 3 decades of my life belonged to someone else in principle, if not yet in keys. Ethan came home early again that day. He stood in the doorway of the living room, hands at his sides, the tension in his shoulders no longer masked by irritation. "You already accepted?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Yes." Lauren remained upstairs for most of the evening, her footsteps measured and deliberate across the hallway. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled across rooms. Only a recalibration happening in real time. 2 weeks later, the moving truck arrived at 9 in the morning. I had arranged for professional movers to handle my belongings. 2 suitcases, 1 trunk of photographs, several labeled boxes, and the quilt that once rested beneath the bed. The rest of the furniture would remain with the house, part of the negotiation that ensured a smoother sale. I stood in the driveway while the men carried out the final box. The maple tree was nearly bare now, its red leaves scattered across the lawn in quiet surrender to the season. Ethan stepped outside and joined me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was crisp, just under 50 degrees, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. "I did not think you would actually do it," he admitted finally. I studied his face, seeing both the boy he once was and the man who had assumed my permanence without question. "I know," I said gently. Lauren remained by the front door, her expression unreadable, her plans for renovation dissolved into logistics of relocation. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel resentment. I felt alignment. When the last box was secured in the truck, I retrieved the keys from my coat pocket and placed them in Ethan's hand. "The closing is on Friday," I said. "You will have time." He closed his fingers around the keys slowly, the weight of metal carrying more than function. I walked to my car, a modest sedan that had served me faithfully for years, and placed the trunk inside carefully. Before getting in, I turned once more toward the house. The windows reflected the pale autumn sky. The front porch, once a place of evening conversations and iced tea, stood empty. It no longer felt like mine, and that was precisely why leaving felt possible. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The navigation system displayed the address of a coastal condominium 2 states south, one with a small balcony and a clear view of the Atlantic Ocean. The drive would take approximately 8 hours. I did not rush. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a final glimpse of Ethan standing in the driveway, the keys still in his hand. The house behind him would soon carry new furniture, new voices, new intentions. I did not carry bitterness with me. I carried documents, memories, and a future shaped by my own decision. Silence had not been weakness. It had been preparation. And now, with the road stretching steadily ahead, I understood that leaving was not abandonment. It was authorship.